Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and I am joined today by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Hello.
And Alex Stewart.
Hello.
Who I can't see because your face is hidden behind a computer screen from me. There you go. The magic of camera angles and positioning. Today we are here to talk about Southampton, but before we do, a quick little shout out to someone who I think now is certainly Alex and I's favourite listener. It is, what was his name? He-Man from Stockholm, who listened to last week's podcast where we said at the beginning about how we're not on Spotify, having some issues. And he contacted us. He works for Spotify in Stockholm, and he contacted us and then very kindly contacted the UK office for us directly. And now we're available on Spotify.
Oh, we really?
And we're available on Spotify.
Oh,
now.
I'm going to listen to all of our past episodes on the way home.
Please do.
Yeah.
I think it'll be wonderful. And have a little one.
Also, my
tiny bit of
favourite
move,
listener.
a little bit closer.
A little bit closer.
There you go. Yeah.
We're actually going to sort of telling me what to do rather than sort of vague hand signals.
It's because you don't understand my hands.
Yeah, I'd say
Who wouldn't
some of your
understand
hand
this?
signals, a little bit ambiguous.
But Iman, thank you so much. We really appreciate this. That was a very kind thing to do, and it made me think, isn't it wonderful that we have so many listeners that we can say pretty much anything, and then someone will do something.
That's very kind.
I'd like a free house. I'd like a lifetime supply of
Careful with what you say next.
chocolate.
Okay.
Let's
All right.
say,
Yep.
and maybe some more friends would be good as well. Actually,
that went somewhere dark, didn't it?
Scratch that one. Don't want any more friends. Southampton. This is going to be exciting. Seb, the weekend you were at St Mary's for the victory against Tottenham, which we can talk about. Alex, you are a Southampton fan.
I am.
And have been for over 6 months, I think. Since it suited you to say that. Was that true? Or?
Yeah, no.
Oh, your whole life?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I used to have a season ticket back in the early 2000s.
And you handed it in because you were disappointed with their playing style?
No, I handed it in because it got so expensive to travel to and from games.
Sure.
Because I was at university.
Well, there you go. If listeners ever needed a proper confirmation that the Premier League is too expensive these days, you've heard it there from Alex, wealthy Alex himself. Even he can't afford it. So who's it for? It's not for the working class. It's not for the middle class. It's clearly not for the lower upper class.
I'll have to sell some land or something
Exactly.
to go.
Exactly. Okay, I've written a bunch of things down here. I'm not sure which order to go in. Of course, the main thing I think that we're going to talk about, or at least the main thing that will litter conversations that we have throughout the podcast, will be about Ralph Hasenhuttl, who has been there, I think, since December now. So he's had a few months to bed in. I found this amazing quote from him that he said, and I believe it was his first press conference, and I'm going to recite it now. He said, "You can expect a very passionate kind of football with 11 characters on the field who know exactly what to do. When you see us playing in the summer, it will be very different to how you see the team now. I can't guarantee how many results you'll earn from that, but if you want guarantees, buy a washing machine. In football, there are no guarantees. I hope it's enough to stay in the division." And these themes are still prevalent now, of course. Southampton, I think it's fair to say, despite the weekend's result, that they are still, fighting in a relegation battle. Is that fair to say?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. But, to take the sort of the part of his quote there saying, look, we're going to look different in the summer, he recognises that instilling his sort of playing style, and I think more, from reading more of what Hasenhüttl has said, more about instilling the different kind of attitude in his players as well, is something that does take time. But we're seeing improvements already, aren't we, Alex?
Certainly, there's. I think there's more sense of a style that's at least being attempted.
Yeah.
One of the issues that we had under Hughes was not just slight arbitrariness in terms of formational decisions, but it did feel like there wasn't really a coherent idea of what was being attempted.
Yeah.
And I think Hasenhüttl's been quite sensible, and we were talking, Seb and I, before the pod about, for example, the differences in the intensity of pressing in the first and second half against Spurs. But that to me is a tactical decision. It's not necessarily an overall stylistic one. And I think Hasenhüttl has clearly sought to get the team to do certain kinds of things with more consistency than I think Hughes ever managed. It's a team that's been in transition. I mean, obviously, ever since Pochettino took over from Nigel Atkins, Pochettino had a very clear style which has been consistent through his career, and Southampton played that style. And then Ronald Koeman, Claude Puel, Pellegrino, it's sort of all been a little bit, are we one thing, are we the other?
Mm.
And now I think there's a manager who, interestingly, the style that he's using at Southampton so far is actually quite different in some respects from what he has used previously, and shows an ability to adapt to the playing staff that he has at his disposal as much as get his own set of ideas across.
Mm.
But I watch them now thinking, okay, I can see what they're trying to do now.
Mm. There's
and
a coherent
under
idea.
Hughes, that wasn't really the case.
Yeah. Well, Seb, let's start with the game at the weekend then. I imagine that you've seen Southampton earlier in the season before Hasenhüttl's arrival. I don't know, maybe not.
Well, quite coincidentally, actually, I saw them a little bit before his arrival. I was at his first game against Cardiff. I was at the win over Fulham 10 days ago, and I was at Saturday. So I've been lucky to kind of have a broad oversight on Southampton's progress this season. It's very interesting. Like I remember the obviously having spent time in plenty of Mark Hughes press conferences. You certainly expected a few things when you went to Southampton, which was if they lost, there was an excuse. And I remember thinking after that Cardiff game, which they lost 1-0 to a really poor defensive mistake. And Hasenhüttl came in and it was so different because he came in and he talked about it and there were no excuses. It was very blunt. He was doing that thing where he was very clearly annoyed, but also very aware that he was in public with Sky cameras on him. So it was sort of his face was placid, his eyes were burning, kind of situation. And he talks very pragmatically about the game. I mean, his English is good, his comprehension of English possibly not at the same level. So what tends to happen is when he's asked a question, he'll tend to monologue in quite a broad way, which is really interesting journalistically because you learn a lot. You learn a lot about what he's trying to do, and you learn beyond the boundaries of the original question. And that's it would be easier if Southampton had been on a low curve upwards ever since. They haven't really been. I would say that Saturday, maybe this is one for Alex, I say Saturday's probably the best I've seen. Saturday's second half is the best I've seen them since he arrived.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So yeah, it's starting to look good. I still think, as ever, as with Pochettino, when you get these guys who come in who have a really specific design on how to play and who stand for something ideologically, there's always a time lag. There's always a period of time where you have false dawns where you think, well, that went well, and that 20 minutes within the game was really productive, but then there's a step back somewhere. So in Southampton's case, it would be the home loss to Cardiff, which was just, I think that came a week after winning Leicester or Palace, or one of the two. I can't remember.
I can't.
It was a good result, though. It was either way. What I thought, or I saw a result. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was Palace, and James Ward-Prowse scored. And I remember thinking, right, that's it now. This is not going to work properly until the summer and beyond. But this is the point where you strike Southampton out of that relegation conversation and you separate them from teams like Brighton, Newcastle,
Fulham.
Well, Fulham are in their own sort of Huddersfield category, sadly for them. But yeah, that kind of thing. At the time, yes, Fulham. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned James Ward-Prowse there. I wanted to bring him up anyway.
Yep.
And it, again, fits in with the theme of Hasenhüttl's takeover, because he seems to be, not necessarily a completely different player, but I was chatting to Alex about this before, and this is a conversation we've had in the past, and thoughts we've had observing James Ward-Prowse in the past, is that there's always been an undoubted potential there. It's funny to think he's only 24. I mean, it feels like he's been established in that team for such a long time.
Honestly, I looked up the Southampton statistics on the train up here today, and I thought, I can't be 24.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, he's been around for so long.
The thing that is often commented on regarding Ward-Prowse is his technical ability, which is obviously very, very good.
Yeah.
He's very, very proficient. We all know about his set-piece delivery from dead ball situations. He scored a few free kicks recently.
That's been a constant. His set-piece delivery has always been superb.
That's always been really good. One of the things that hasn't been a constant throughout his career, and one of the criticisms of him before the last 10 games, let's say, is his inability to score enough goals from situations in which he should. And also, I think about him, I associate him with the group of players who were skimmed off the Southampton squad to other big teams over the last few years, and James Ward-Prowse was always the one who was left behind, which for Saints fans is a great thing. It's an indicator of what other clubs think of him as well. But the last 10 games, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that he is now the leading English midfield scorer in the Premier League. Not only is his attacking game seemed to have not necessarily improved, but had those finishing touches added to
Yeah.
it. But also, he's tackling all over the field. He looks like, Hasenhüttl described him as the complete midfielder. What do you make of him? Because he was instrumental at the weekend.
Complete midfielder, probably a little bit strong for me. Maybe that's one of the kind of lost in translation bits with Hasenhüttl. What I will say is he's become more
positive reinforcement.
Maybe it's a Mourinhoism. Or a Brendan Rodgersism, to be more contemporary.
I think Mourinho's negative reinforcement.
Yeah, it certainly is now, yeah. I'd say the main difference I've seen is that he's more aggressive. Like right. I think the knock on Ward-Prowse was that he's always been a very cultured player. He's been a wonderful ball striker. His set-piece delivery speaks for itself. But was he someone that actually worked as hard as he possibly could to change games? In open play, that is. And I think certainly against Fulham and Spurs, the energy in his game, I know that's a bit of a woolly platitude, but his determination to be in scoring positions. If you think about his goal against Fulham, that sort of, it relied on a goalkeeping mistake, but would James Ward-Prowse a year or two ago been in that position to score? Probably not. So the tapping at the back post, it's that kind of opportunist gambling run that so many goal-scoring midfielders have made, and you can
the following in, right?
Yeah.
I think there's also a thing with him, which is that he has suffered a little bit from being good enough at certain things to play in different positions and maybe not making enough of any of those things to secure one. So he has played as a 10, he has played as a 7, he's played as an 8, he can play as a 6.
Played as a fullback once, wasn't he?
Possibly.
I believe so.
Yeah,
someone's done their research.
Thank you.
More than me. But I think that's because his through passes are excellent. He is a creative player. He's a very good crosser of the ball. But perhaps as an adjunct to what you were saying, he never quite put down a marker to say, I'm going to be the creative player around whom you build your side in the 10 position, or as a deep lying playmaker alongside a more combative midfielder.
And is that what he is now, Alex? In Hasenhüttl's new Southampton, is he the key player?
In certain phases.
Yeah, I would say.
I'd say that there's still a reliance offensively on Nathan Redmond.
Yes.
A little bit, but Ward-Prowse is, but by the game, becoming more and more influential.
I mean, I think if you look at the Spurs game, the key passing combination for most of that game was Ryan Bertrand to Nathan Redmond, and Angus Gunn certainly was kicking most of his goal kicks and long passes out towards Bertrand or Redmond, and there was a lot coming down that left-hand flank. But I think what Ward-Prowse can do is use the dynamism that's on the other side, and Valerie has developed really well and is playing well, but he's a less aggressive wing-back than Bertrand, and he's less technically capable than Bertrand. So it allows Ward-Prowse to drift in field and kind of wait for the ball to come to him a little bit from that left-hand side, and then find himself in difficult, dangerous positions to then push forwards and get a strike on goal or try and play someone in.
You know what occurred to me? I back in I spent a lot of time with that generation's under-21 side in their qualifying games and their the England under-21s and their final tournament in Poland in 2017. And Alex and I were talking about this beforehand. Angus Gunn, I spent a bit of time in mixed zones with, and James Ward-Prowse did too. And he's a really impressive person. It's a kind of common trait of players who've been reared in Southampton who come through their academy. There's a sort of there's a method to the way they talk, which a lot of their peers don't always have. And Ward-Prowse is someone that you can actually have a conversation with. I remember I interviewed him after England got knocked out on penalties by Germany. And he's so the intelligence he demonstrates makes it kind of, I mean, it's hindsight talking, but it doesn't makes it unsurprising that he's adapted to new tactical instruction in the middle of a season. So kind of, I think we talked about the difficulties of transitioning to a new style, particularly without the benefit of a pre-season. I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like Hasenhüttl comes in with a set of relatively complex instructions, and someone like that adapts well to it. I think it's one of the great underrated attributes in football is comprehension, intelligence, and the ability to act on instruction.
It's funny that we say it's underrated, because when we see it in a player at the top level, and it makes such an obvious difference. Everyone recognises that, but
Joe, I think there's two different types. There's a kind of the intelligence in the sense that people go, oh, Teddy Sheringham's a really intelligent player, like because he can play a reverse pass. But then there's the kind of the more academic intelligence, whereby someone can actually watch a video analysis session and assimilate what's happening, what he's being told, what he has to do to develop as a player.
Are we talking about players who might end up going on to be the better coaches with that sort of?
I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily. I don't think I understand the correlation between good player, good intelligent player, and better coach, because I don't know. I haven't studied it, but I mean, it's not a surprise that he's doing well here and now. Put it that way.
I think also Southampton have got two other players that fit that. Bertrand being one, and also Højbjerg. Højbjerg learned a lot from his time at Bayern Munich under Guardiola, and was kind of
his eye for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was sort of the heir apparent to that intelligent screening defensive midfielder who's such a key to the way that Guardiola sets his teams up, and that was supposed to be Højbjerg, and it was kind of a surprise when he moved to Southampton in that regard. But there are clearly a few players in that team who think about the game in a certain kind of way, and I'm sure there are plenty of other players that don't, but it does make a difference. And I think that Hasenhüttl does have a particular kind of system, a particular kind of style, and it's similar to, say, when Jurgen Klopp arrived at Liverpool. There was always going to be a period of transition, and there's always going to be a time lag before those ideas were fully comprehended, let alone before they were put into place. But having players like Ward-Prowse and Bertrand and Højbjerg in the squad will make that transition easier.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Hasenhüttl's preferred setup then. The players that we're mentioning slot into this. What's he doing differently? I mean, I know it's difficult for us to give a brief idea of what Mark Hughes was doing, because there were so many different.
Yeah.
You literally cannot. Honestly, if you're going to eat nicotine gum, just get 3 or 4 of them out before we start recording the podcast.
You know what? Actually, that's.
Do you remember you were talking before about a man with a smile and burning eyes? That's me. Whenever you do this.
God, actually, he's more frightening than Hasenhüttl. Look at his. He does that.
They're about the same height as well.
Yeah, they are. I have now got an extra piece out, so that we won't. Yeah.
So you can have your nicotine like
it's been an early start and a stressful morning full of train delays.
Yeah. Right.
What's he doing?
Right. So Hasenhüttl, what's interesting is that he made his reputation at Ingolstadt.
I bet you don't do that on the BT podcast, do you?
No, I don't.
No, it's a lack of respect. Okay, we know that now. Alex, do continue.
Okay, thanks. So at Ingolstadt he played a 4-3-3, and the two key facets of it were very, very intense pressing throughout the pitch, high, medium, and low, and a very direct style of play, particularly into the channels between the fullback and the centre back, and then looking for pullbacks. And it was basically any opportunity to counter-attack was taken. A lot of long passing, and
we've kept the directness at Southampton, haven't we?
Exactly, yes. So I think what's interesting for me is that both at Ingolstadt and Leipzig, Hasenhüttl very rarely, if ever, used a back three. To me, the use of the back three at Southampton, which has been very consistent through his selections, is because none of our centre-backs are particularly good. And so I think he's compensating for that.
You've got a Van Dijk-shaped hole.
Right. I think Bednarak has potential. I think Vestergaard is growing into the team. Otherwise, I think we look a bit light in that respect, and playing three is always a good way of compensating for that. It does allow Bertrand, Valery, and we've got a couple of others like Matt Targett who can get forwards from wing-back and create that directness, so they will sort of surge down there, down the flanks, and basically the passing is all directed out into that space.
I mean, Valery was very direct against Man United, wasn't he?
Yeah, he had a great game agaast United.
That goal was unbelievable.
He played well against Spurs.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good player. He's still, again, he's very young. He's
learning.
19, 20, I think, and has spent a period of time in the Southampton youth setup. He was taken from Rennes or Reims or someone like that, a French team beginning with R. But when he was still in his teens, So again, he's kind of been around the system for a little bit, and he has been touted as a prospect for the last couple of years.
Because obviously as well, Hasenhüttl was at Leipzig.
Yeah.
And we know when he was there, he played with the 4-2-2-2 formation, which was potentially a hangover from Ralph Rangnick, which is why it was difficult for us to understand whether that was his idea, whether he would have played that anyway, whether that was directed from above. Are we seeing any elements of that team?
Not really. I suppose insofar as you've got two wider attacking midfielders that can drift in and attack the half spaces and look to feed off a central striker, which is sort of what the wide players in the 4-4-2 or 4-2-2-2 at Leipzig did. It was interesting because actually I kind of thought that Leipzig formation might work at Southampton, and Hughes played something not dissimilar to that a couple of times, but without anywhere near the kind of dynamism or creativity that Leipzig managed. I think bluntly, it's particularly when you're in a relegation battle, the first thing to do is secure your back line and stop the leaking of goals. And exactly as Seb said against Cardiff, and it's been a consistent theme this season, there are defensive errors. There are mistakes that lead to goals, bad clearances.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, Jack Stevens is quite often culpable of that. Yoshida can push too far out. So I think that's why maybe again once we get to the summer we'll see something if a good central defender is brought in, or if Vestergaard and Bednarak develop as a partnership as a two, we may see a reversion to what we'd expect more from Hasenhüttl.
Okay. And Seb, there's been a lot of talk about Hasenhüttl's in-game management as well. We saw at the weekend there were a couple of substitutions made. It was at half time, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was straight away. It was interesting. It's very rare to see a doubles change straight after the break. Usually you have
it's a bold move,
15
right?
minutes. Yeah. So he took off Charlie Austin, replaced him with Shane Long, took off Oriol Romeo, and put on Josh Sims, who is a academy-bred winger who played very, very well. Actually, a little shout out to Jack Rosser from the Evening Standard, because he's been boring on about Josh Sims for a really long time. Anytime I've seen him at Southampton, he's
but it's fair to say that he's a different sort of player to Oriol Romeo. So taking him off and replacing him with Sims, I mean, it's again bold to do at half time, bold move anyway, right?
Right. Well, the problem with Romeo on Saturday was that obviously Spurs had Dele Alli back, and great footballer that Ali is, one of his great strengths is his pressing on the ball, and he was very clearly detailed to get right in Romeo's face anytime he received a pass from any of his defenders. And Romeo's weakness is his first touch. He is a blocker, a stopper kind of midfielder. I don't think I'm not trying to denigrate his technical ability, but he's not blessed in that department. And so Ali was sort of yapping around him anytime Southampton trying to work their way up the field. And so it made sense, get him off. After the game, Hasenhüttl talked about, just to sort of caveat with his level of English, he was talking about how the aim of that substitution was to disrupt Tottenham in their build-up phases, to get a little bit more pressure on Jan Vertonghen and Davinson Sanchez, because in the first half, there was no press whatsoever. They had Charlie Austin up front. Charlie Austin, not a natural athlete, I think it's fair to say. Good finisher, but is he the hardest working player without the ball? Probably not. And you replaced him with Sims, who was full of adrenaline and energy and, youthful vigor, and Shane Long, whose finest attribute is what he does without the ball. And
he's a real tryhard.
Yeah, he's a pain, and that's a compliment. He's a real pain,
like a little midgie.
He's like an Irish Jamie Vardy without the goals.
I should caveat that by saying I mean like mosquito, a midgie. I don't mean an offensive term for small people. I mean midgie.
Okay.
We've got listeners from around the world. Do they use the word midgie elsewhere? Is it? What is a midgie? Is it different to a mosquito? I mean, isn't it?
It's a midge.
A midge.
Yeah.
There's no E.
Oh.
I mean,
you've created a mythical insect.
Is this a bit like when I was in PE at school and someone asked us did an activity and they said, "What is that?" And I put my hand up and said, "That's a roly-poly, sir." When it's a forward roll.
I know roly-poly.
Midgies for a long time.
Have you been saying this a lot?
I'm just saying. Do you think that's
we might be able to get to the root of that lack of friends?
Is it a bit like? Is it a bit like how I thought a specific type of flower was called an Alice and Joe for a long time? because that's my name and my sister's name. And mother said it. Mother said mother said those were the names of the flowers.
And she was wrong.
Yeah. Well, anyway, to be clear, I meant a small bug that is irritating and bites you, not a small person.
So Shane Long.
That was a
I think
weird digression.
Sit a couple of plays out. I think now.
Good Lord.
Yeah, it worked extremely well. What was also impressive was, unfortunately, 20 minutes in the second half, Shane Long and Jan Vertonghen had a little bit of a collision, and Shane Long tried to run off but couldn't.
Yeah.
Seemed to Hasenhüttl said at the time there's a hamstring problem. Doesn't know the scope of it yet, but so he had to come off, and then on came Stuart Armstrong. So it was really 3 reorganisations within the space of 90 minutes, and the effect was very dramatic. I mean, I'm a Tottenham fan, and it was a dispiriting loss, really. But I think one of the problems with now, whenever a member of the top 6 loses, even away from home, it's kind of this, well, it's about them. And yeah, there's definitely fault to find with Spurs, and and Pochettino touched on that in his press conference. However, that shouldn't come at the cost of recognising what Hasenhüttl and Southampton did well. I mean, even their second goal. So the discussion about that has been, was it given in the right place? Well, actually ignore that and look at the finish, but also look at the move which produced it. That is a pure, undiluted version of the type of football Hasenhüttl was supposed to bring. Great counter-attack. Tottenham in absolute disarray, caught cold, and Kyle Walker-Peters with no option but to drag back. Probably could have been a red card as well.
Yeah,
I thought it was at the time, but I haven't seen the replay of it yet. It's a great bit of football. It's a great bit of a great bit of game awareness. What the situation is within the game, where your opponent's weak points are on the field, and then the ability to exploit them. It was a tremendous reaction.
Yeah.
Because at half time, I don't think you'd have found a person in the stadium that would have backed a Southampton win.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Southampton are currently now sitting in 16th place, 30 points. Cardiff City are the threat, I would have thought, from the relegation zone, 28 points. Fulham and Huddersfield, as you said earlier, are kind of in a league of their own at the moment.
I think Brighton are going down.
You think Brighton are going down?
Yeah.
Brighton currently a game in hand and 3 points ahead of Southampton.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes you say that?
I like Cardiff. I think the nervier and more rugged the football becomes as we approach the end of the season, the more effective they'll be, just because they're equipped for it.
Yeah.
And Brighton, I don't know. There's something about I think Southampton. I know the cliche says there's no such thing as being too good to go down. I think there's more reason to believe in Southampton's safety than Brighton's. I see some actual development in the side. I see an easier run in. Southampton's only possibly unwinnable game is against Liverpool.
Right.
I expect they'll lose that. However, Brighton, they're not defending as well as they were. Their midfield is a bit curious. They're with and without Pascal Gross, who's really influential. Glenn Murray scored a very fine goal over the weekend, as did Anthony Knockaert. But I don't know. It's just I saw what Brighton were last season, and I see the regression this year. And maybe it's in a historical bias on my part. It just fits the pattern of that second season too neatly for me to look away from at the moment. So yeah, I'd say I think Cardiff will get out of it. I think Southampton will move out of it within the next sort of 6 weeks.
Well, as you say, you look at these fixtures. I mean, the first thing to say is that Southampton visit Brighton at the end of March, which will be an interesting game.
I think they'll win that game.
You mentioned that they're at home to Liverpool, which is a tough one.
Yep.
They are away to Watford. They are at home to Wolves, away to Newcastle, home to Bournemouth, away to West Ham, and home to Huddersfield.
I think
you think that's a good run in.
Well,
right?
the thing that jumps out there is not just the winnable game like Huddersfield, and but there are a lot of games there against teams who, by the time they play, will have very little left to play for, and that's always decisive.
Yeah,
it's always very important at this point in the season.
Yeah, okay. Whereas Brighton have left to play, amongst others, Tottenham, Arsenal, Man City on the final day.
It's horrible. Yeah.
It's a horrible run.
It's horrible.
They're also at home to Bournemouth. They're at home to Newcastle. These are enormous games. They've got a really horrible run in. You're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
It doesn't look good.
The other thing I wanted to talk about with Southampton, and this is a sort of broader theme that we can, I think we're all aware of it. Most people are aware of it. The idea that people have in their head of Southampton, from a few steps back, is that they're a plucky little club who have an incredible recent history record of developing young players, right?
Mhm.
And there's a joke has been made of how many Southampton players have ended up at Liverpool, but there's plenty of players elsewhere. Most notable example, potentially not Liverpool, is Gareth Bale. We also have further back Theo Walcott,
And Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain as well.
Oxlade-Chamberlain,
Luke Shaw,
Callum
Chambers,
Chambers, Adam Lallana, Ricky Lambert went somewhere else,
Sadio
didn't
Mane, obviously, as well. Who's
Morgan Schneidlin, that didn't quite work out.
No, Jose Font to West Ham. That was as smart a bit of business as I've ever seen.
Victor,
West Ham, the last club in the world to know what everybody else does, as always.
Victor Wanyama.
Yeah.
I mean, there's basically
Virgil van Dijk, of course.
Oh, of course, Virgil van Dijk. I mean, there's a million players.
Yeah.
1 million, I would say.
and that's a mix of good youth development
Good talent
and
spotting.
selling, but then also good acquisition of players with a good resale value.
Right, so there are a few things I want to ask now based on everything that we've just said. The first one is, and do tell me when I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Right. That my perception is, and I believe that one of the perceptions of Southampton is that in the last few years, and this potentially comes in line with the slightly more confusing or with less clarity around the management and what they're attempting to do, and again, a little bit of a shift over with ownership a couple of years ago, is that Southampton aren't doing that to the same degree that they once were. Firstly, is that true, or is that a misconception?
I think there are fewer players of that quality being produced. There is still a fairly consistent stream of players that are, generally speaking, sort of fringe squad players who may get the odd FA Cup game or something. I mean, of the recent list, Harrison Reed looked very promising when he came into the first team at Southampton. That kind of fell away a little bit, and he's been on loan since. Jake Hesketh, again, got a debut when he was very young and straight away was injured, crunching tackle against Burnley, and he was somebody who looked like he might have made a breakthrough. McQueen, Target, these are good kind of...
Where's Isgrove? Has he left the club?
I'm not... Yeah, he's on loan at Portsmouth from Barnsley.
Okay, so strike him from the list, yeah.
Is there an argument to say that, as we mentioned, less clarity over what management plans are, or even to put it more boldly, slightly shitter managers, has a knock-on effect when you want to reach the final bit of developing these players? Let's look at it from a totally cynical point of view, sell on value, right?
Yeah.
You get these incredible youth prospects who break into the first team. If they aren't then well coached or well utilised, they don't then take the next step. Is there a potential argument to say that since Koeman maybe...
there's also a continuity argument here as well, is that Southampton's turnover of managers has been greater than usual over the last few seasons, and the great enemy of the youth player is change at that level, because you don't get the opportunity to kind of to foster any trust with the manager.
But then, of course, that
even
happened.
A relationship.
That's been happening, I would say, pretty much since they were. I mean, look, certainly with slightly longer periods. But I remember when they were promoted and then sacked Nigel Atkins before they played a game.
Yeah,
is that unusual for Southampton?
No. They sacked him after a 2-2 draw at Chelsea. Was it, Alex? There's a Jason punch and goal.
It wasn't long into the season,
so it wasn't. I remember it being around the turn of the year.
It was an odd. It was an odd one.
It was an odd one.
Two promotions from Atkins.
But what I would say now, it's an odd one at the time. But given who they brought in,
of course,
not so odd. But I mean, in that case, Pochettino's a little bit of a case apart, because part of his ideology is to grow components from within. It's kind of, that's his style of management. It's not necessarily a kind of it's not indicative of life at either Southampton or Tottenham. It's just they appointed him for that specific reason. Mm-hmm. That is what he does. I think, say, Mark Hughes. Actually, you go with this.
I mean, I'm not sure Mark Hughes necessarily.
He came in as a firefighter.
Yeah, he wasn't in a position to do that. I think there is a flip side. I don't disagree with what Seb's saying in terms of a high turnover of management can lead to a regression in the productivity of the youth academy. Having said that, Pochettino and Koeman both gave debuts to 5 youth academy players each. If you're a club like Southampton, I think it can be reframed to look at it the other way around, which is that perhaps from an owner's and sort of overall football strategy perspective, there is a greater than usual degree of pressure to give debuts to academy prospects, some of whom may not be up to it.
Yeah.
So rather than saying, youth academy players aren't breaking through because the manager keeps changing, it's possibly players who aren't necessarily of the requisite quality are sort of ending up there because there's this kind of sense of, well, let's give the youngsters a go, which in some regards could possibly even lead to a higher management turnover because results don't go that well. I mean, I don't think I've really looked at any. I mean, I've always had a soft spot for Harrison Reed, but after Ward-Prowse, I think the academy prospects, the two who've excited me most have been Hesketh and Obafemi, who's now
a good player.
Yeah, he's now out injured for probably the rest of the season. But again, you look at players like McQueen and Target. They are good, solid, low to middle Premier League players, but they're not a Gareth Bale. They're not an Oxlade-Chamberlain. These were guys who, when we watched them, were clearly destined for serious things.
Yeah.
It's worth saying at this point also, in a broader, non-specific to Southampton way, like recruitment has become harder. The age of like a Rod Ruddock uncovering a Gareth Bale has probably passed because the big fish in the sea, they are now set up to take a big trawl net through football's oceans and dump whatever they find in their own academy.
Yeah.
So you don't get these players. You don't get... I mean, one of the problems, of course, yes, is the Premier League and how inhibiting that is for managers who want to blood developing players from their academy. Another thing is, a lot of these players don't really exist. I mean, every fan thinks that they've got a future Messi in their academy. Like Tottenham have it with Marcus Edwards. It's the same thing. It's just that these players migrate, as Chelsea have shown, as Manchester City will show in due course, given the investment in their own infrastructure.
Yeah.
That they hoard them.
Yeah.
And so the age of a Southampton being able to develop and sell on an Oxlade-Chamberlain, a Walcott, a Bale, it's probably yesterday's thinking.
Well, you may have just answered this question, but
Okay.
Kevin Toman asks, why did Les Reed's recruiting skills decline so quickly after 2014, especially in replacing the key players they sold? And he lists Alana, Wanyama, Van Dijk, and even Ricky Lambert.
I don't know that they did.
Well, you mentioned Les Reed last week on last week's podcast, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems with Les Reed was, forget the talent recruitment to start with, who did he appoint as manager? Because Les Reed was also a board member before he departed the club. And you look at the appointments and you look at... Okay, so if you go back to... Alex, fact check me as I go through this and jump in as and when, but bring Claude Puel. And that... I watched a lot of that side and the reaction to it was not great, particularly at home. It was very cautious. Puel favours sort of possessional style, caused him similar issues at Leicester, of course, and he's now left that job too. And then so in response to that, you bring in Pellegrino, also a very cautious manager, also very defensively orientated. And, after a little bit of a period of grace, the same atmosphere was at St Mary's. I mean, I don't mean this as a criticism of the fans, but it was probably at that time the most toxic home ground in the league. Not toxic in the kind of everyone hates the board and, just in the sort of, it must have been very inhibiting for a player to play in front of that because there was so much anxiety.
Yeah.
And all it would take was a player to receive the ball in and around the centre circle, to Cruyff turn back towards his own goal, and you could hear the groans. I understood it because the club was in decline and there was a general frustration, but Reed was complicit in creating that because if you're making these decisions, then you have to pay you have to deal with the consequences of what it creates. And it was this sort of residual negativity, which has only really just started to go away. I thought one of the interesting things about Saturday and Fulham before was that when they were defending a lead, there was very little anxiety. It was the crowd was right behind the team. Whereas at the end of last season, when I was at the Brighton game, I think when Glenn Murray scored a very late penalty equaliser, it might have even been in stoppage time, it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy because Southampton had the lead, they had a 2-goal lead, and then for want of a better expression, they fucked it. And the crowd I don't want to lay the blame at the crowd for that, but you could feel it about to happen. And against Brighton away from home, Brighton are not Liverpool. They're not sort of they don't overflow with goals. They can't hurt you from anywhere. They have to work for each and every goal they score. And yet it was coming, and eventually there was the mistake in the penalty box. I can't remember who it was, but someone needlessly shoved someone to the ground, and that's gone. And that is a tremendous burden off Southampton's.
I think Southampton, certainly as long as I have been watching them properly and regularly since, like I say, the early 2000s, they've always been quite an attacking side, not necessarily in terms of producing huge amounts of quality. I mean, back in sort of, the Peter Crouch days, it was Jason Dodd banging a long ball down to Peter Crouch to cross it into somebody else to score.
Wasn't it wonderful?
It was great. It worked. But
bring back the olden days,
right?
I could watch Letizia
Michael
forever.
Svensson. But I think there was an ambition in the style of football and in the approach, even if there wasn't necessarily an ambition in terms of the appointment of managers. And then that ambition in the appointment of managers did continue, or became a thing with Pochettino and Koeman, certainly. And it felt like the two appointments that came after that were very much damage limitation, safety first appointments, which didn't just say that, there's a lack of ambition in terms of where the club is going to go, but also that because safety first doesn't imply that you're, going again for European qualification. But it also created a style of football that was anathema to the way that I'd always associated us playing.
Yeah.
And with Hasenhüttl's appointment, and I was asked back in, I don't know, like September or something, who would I take of available managers at the club to replace Hughes? And I said Hasenhüttl kind of almost as a joke because I never thought it would happen. But that counter-attacking, aggressive, direct style is something that we've profited from in the past and has produced good football for us. And that, coupled with the fact that he's a guy, who's coached at a high level, who is seen as progressive, who's seen as having, like Seb says, almost an ideology, that to me takes the club back to the sort of thing that we were doing before.
Yeah. Okay. Let's briefly talk about the owners, because this always excites me. I did a little bit of a rereading this morning. I rewatched a video that we made about Gao Jisheng, who is the Chinese owner or majority owner of Southampton. I think Katharina Lieber still owns a small minority.
So Zhao owns 80% of the club as of, I think,
2017?
September 2017, August 2017.
Yeah. He's got a very interesting story. Again, he's one of my favourite characters in Premier League ownership, because he's one of the guys who, beginning of every story, it says, not much is known about Zhao's youth, because this is a whole period of history where there's no records of anything, right? But Zhao apparently has had various different jobs before he became the owner of Southampton, and also the owner of Landa, which is a big Chinese real estate company that he started. He was a military policeman. I think he was a journalist, although I can't find any reference to that outside of the script that James Montague wrote for us. So I'm sure James has his sources, but
if Montague says it, it's true.
If Montague says it, it's true, but I can't find that anywhere. He was something else as well. But anyway, I was reading a bit more about him this morning. I read a very strange blog from a man who I assume was working for a charity who Zhao was contributing to. He'd gone for dinner with Zhao and his family, and he'd sort of written up this blog with no spell checking at all. He kept calling him Mr. Goer instead of Mr. Zhao.
Mr. Goer sounds like a guy that went on a gap year and never came back, doesn't it? Like someone from a minor public school somewhere has just gone, I'm just Mr. Goer now. He's 50, he's still living on a beach,
Yeah. But it was very interesting. He as it would in this sort of blog, but it described him as a very, very nice man with good intentions for Southampton. However, further reading shows that the reason that he invested in the first place was because he was inspired to do so by another businessman from Hong Kong who started investing in the UK. That's a very loud drill. And he said, this is what happens when you start talking about the wealthy.
Yeah.
People try and
break
break
silenced.
in. Yeah, you get silenced.
People turn up with loud drills.
And I'm sure that, look, for the reasons that many of the Premier League's owners and many of top flight football owners all across the world, one of the main reasons they will do this is, in the modern game, at least in the Premier League, is because of, for investment reasons. It makes sense. However, the reason I mention it is because I think it's worth considering that if, alongside a host of other Chinese companies and individuals who are investing in clubs who have no sort of prior involvement in football, who potentially aren't football fans or know that much about football beforehand. In fact, listening back to James's video again, he mentioned that Espanyol were bought by a company who made toy cars. There's no real connection other than Xi Jinping, the premier of China, wanted people to invest in football. That's the only connection.
Yeah.
Does that impact on Southampton as a club today? What can we infer from transfers that they've made? How much money they're spending? How much? I mean, I know it's difficult to say how much involvement the owner actually has, but has there been a notable difference since Liga sold over 80%?
They spent just over £16 million in the summer transfer window, or just around the same mark the year before, although he wasn't quite in control by then.
Yeah.
The Danny Ings transfer was concluded for a lot of money. In my mind, too much money.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I think that was a bit of an overspend on a fairly mediocre Premier League player. I don't know. I think it's too early, Joe. I think kind of one of the things, reference James Montague again, because if people haven't read his Billionaires Club book, they really should, because they, specifically with regards to Asia, there's not necessarily any rhyme or reason with some of this investment. There isn't a thread which binds all these billionaires. That's a very interesting case he uncovers about a guy who invested in AZ Den Haag in the Eredivisie, who just disappeared.
Yeah,
just left and never came back.
Yeah.
It's very strange. So I don't know. I'm not. Obviously, the common bond is Xi Jinping and his attitude towards football, and some of the legislation which has been introduced to combat capital flight in China. But I don't know what his intentions are with the club. I'm not sure. I think often it doesn't hurt to start at the point of recognizing what a good investment the Premier League is. We know terms now like soft power, but that doesn't apply specifically to Chinese investors. So no. I don't know. I don't have anything to offer other than wait and see, I think.
Well, I think there are two different things to say here, and to make it clear, neither of these things apply to Zhao Jinping. But I think the two reasons that we've seen lots of investment from China into football in Europe, for example. The first one, as we mentioned already, is that Xi Jinping, who is effectively the president of China, has declared a great interest in football.
He's a huge fan of the game.
He's a huge fan, and he wants China to compete and win a World Cup. Yeah. And the way that he sees China doing that is by spending more money in football. And what that led to was a huge spending of money from the nation's billionaires, from the wealthiest companies in China itself, but also mainly in Europe. I think there are 6 clubs I think there are 6 clubs in the Premier League who are
a couple outside as well. Like West Brom are Chinese owned now as well.
I was thinking about this when West Brom were still in the Premier League.
So I think it's dropped now.
To Chinese owned. Yeah. But the first reason is because of the way that the Communist Party system works. It's a good thing if the president says, "I'd like to do this." You will go you do it because it aligns you more closely with power. The second is because China have, I think they call it capital state rules, which are quite tightly controlling what money is allowed out of the country. So if there's suddenly a door opened to invest in things in the UK or in Europe by following what appears to be the Premier's want, which is spending money on football, if that means you can suddenly get £200 million out of China when you couldn't previously, that's also a good thing for you. And again, that's not related to anyone specifically, but that is there.
I think that's kind of, this might be incorrect, but my understanding was that that was part of the reason for the delay in this takeover, because it was quite a protracted agreement.
I think it ended up being him as an individual, right?
Yeah, so Zhao owns Southampton with his daughter, Molly.
Yeah,
I think Molly. And they bought the club as privately through funds I think that were held in Hong Kong or something. I'm no financial expert by any stretch of the imagination, but that's so it's a complicated thing.
Well, retrospectively, that's good, because I think last month apparently he lost his controlling stake in Lander, which was previously his real estate company, which he would have bought Southampton through. So it would have meant that this month Southampton would have a different owner technically.
Yeah, I think he only owned 59% of it originally.
Okay,
so it's not quite. I mean, it's still probably not ideal for the Zhao family. You always like to have controlling interest in your own companies, but that's not kind of,
As you say, it's too early to really tell what impact this will have on the club, if any, right?
You've got to judge all these guys in their own individual merits and their record over time.
Yeah. I think there's just 2 very quick things I'd add to that, and I agree with what Seb said. The first is that Katarina Liebherr retaining some stake is important. I mean, obviously, her dad, Marcus, was the guy who basically saved the club in 2009 after we went into administration. And there is certainly towards Marcus, there's a real degree of positivity around the fans because of that. I think the other thing is whether or not his tenure has been altogether a success. Ralph Kruger is still basically running the club on a day-to-day basis and has been doing so since 2014. So there is a consistency there. It's not like Gao has come in and installed his own guy straight away, or brought someone in with some sort of familial connection who doesn't understand football.
Yeah,
and I think that shows an astuteness. Now, whether he will then change these things once he's got his feet more under the table, I don't know. But I would look at that continuity and the appointment of Hasenhüttl as being very big ticks in his favour so far.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a few questions from listeners. Sorry about the builders. I made an error this morning. When I asked people for questions, I asked them for questions relating to Leicester, which is the podcast that we did last week.
We could go back to last week and ask them there and tack it on.
We could do that.
Edit.
But luckily, some people are much smarter than me and remembered from last week that we said we were going to do Southampton. So we have a few questions. The first is from Papagendo. Papagendo says, I assume it's actually about Southampton. Yes, you're correct. So my question is simple. I
assume you're an idiot.
You won't want to answer this question directly, but you might want to talk around it.
He said that, has he?
No, I'm saying
right, okay.
How long until Stuart Armstrong wins the Ballon d'Or?
Quite a while.
Quite a while. Alex said never.
Really good player.
Yeah, sure.
I really like him.
Yeah.
I think he's I thought back in August he would become one of the signings of the season. I think he's as far as Premier League transfers go, pretty good.
I got no idea who he is. Tell me who he is.
So he's midfielder. He came from Celtic. I think the thing to like about him is that he's a good finisher, but also fitting with the sort of the Hasenhüttl ideology. He makes a lot of runs from midfield, which is very, very handy if you're set up to be candidate side.
Okay.
So give him. Let's revisit that one in a year's time, maybe.
He's never going to win the Ballon d'Or.
No, probably not that one. No.
We've talked about young players already, and we talked about the idea that is that happening less or more. I'm not really sure still. But here's a question about the genesis of it, I suppose. Sean Munn asks, assuming you guys mean Southampton. Yes, we did, Sean. Thank you. What is it about them that's caused them to produce a lot of great, or at least good, British players such as Bale, Shaw, Walcott, or Lallana? Does anybody have an answer as to that?
The two very straightforward things are that was an intention that was realised.
Yep.
They knew they wanted to do that, particularly as a result of going into administration, the points deduction. It became a priority.
Yeah.
Also, and it is interesting again to say this drop off since maybe 2014, 2015.
Yeah.
Prior to that point, with Brighton and Bournemouth being the only other sizable clubs after Portsmouth had basically died on its arse. I mean, the Portsmouth fans have done a fantastic job to rehabilitate that club. But it meant that Southampton, as an entity, sort of stood alone in the south central catchment area. There's not a lot happening in the southwest either, so we were able to take quite a few players from, the Plymouth Argyle youth system, for example, who were one of the few clubs in that neck of the woods. That gave us straight away an advantage because we weren't really competing for people with the cream of the crop in that area.
Okay. Here's a good one. Again, we've talked about James Ward-Prowse already, but I think this is a nice question from Keith Kekazawa. Could someone explain to me exactly what type of midfielder James Ward-Prowse is? I've seen him do a lot of roles to decent effect, but I can't make up my mind what exactly his talents are.
I mean, that's literally what I said earlier. I think he's absolutely right.
But how can we put that into a sentence? Because that's what we do here at Tifo Football.
I think he's somewhere between an 8 and a 10.
Like a 9.
No, but not like that. No, I just mean that sort of he has the attributes of both. I mean, he used to play in central midfield for the England Under-21s, and he was very good. He's technically good in tight spaces, which helps for a midfielder. He's developed this. Oh, is the drilling finished? He's developed this kind of this drive and this tenaciousness, which is very, very helpful. I think he's a midfielder in transition. in the abstract sense. I mean, he's growing into something else. I think we are at the beginning of a point in time where James Ward-Prowse will develop into something definitive. What that is, I'm not quite sure yet, but
develop into what? Sorry,
into something definitive. So we will have a better idea of that in probably a year's time. I mean, he's not going to get any deeper than an 8. He doesn't have the attributes to play in those kind of positions. The sort of the Romeu situation. Southampton will almost certainly try and replace Romeu in the summer anyway. So we'll see. But it's just interesting. It's you're seeing a different layer reveal itself almost on a weekly basis at the moment with him, which is fascinating.
I think we should wrap it up now before we before the noise escalates at all.
Yeah.
But thank you very much to everyone for listening. I'm thinking perhaps we could think about doing Brighton next week. Maybe we talked about them a little bit already. If we think they're going to be struggling, best get them in now before they get relegated.
But Joe, you said we weren't needed next week.
Oh, we're not needed next week.
I
am. You're not. The week after. That's true. Thanks for reminding me. Next week, Martino Simsik from Copper 90 is coming back in. I think we're developing on the conversation we had last time, expanding about ultras.
Very exciting.
Very exciting stuff. Very exciting stuff. Personally, I hate the fans.
You know what? I'm gonna put my hand up for Wolves in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
I think Wolves are very, very interesting.
We should do Brighton before they get relegated, though.
Yeah. Okay. We've got time.
Wolves will be around next year.
You can't. Once Joe says maybe we should do this thing, what you need to learn is that is what's happening.
That is kind of what I mean.
He's just doing it in a slightly passive-aggressive
Right,
style.
I got you. Okay.
It's like when I say maybe you shouldn't open your nicotine gum during the podcast
That's
recording.
it. Don't do it.
That's
open
what
your
I'm saying.
fucking
I've caught on to.
Don't do it, or I'll cause problems for you and your family. Right.
Calm exterior, burning eyes.
Yeah.
Seb, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Joe.
Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again next week. Goodbye.